So then people keep asking me, like, are there more, like, or, you know, is there gonna be a sequel? I'm like, no. Like, not right now. But I don't know.
Thank you for coming, everyone. Really appreciate you coming out. My name is Amber. I'm assistant manager here and also the Left Bank Books Foundation coordinator. And I am very honored to do our introductions tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. This is Left Bank Books presents two-time Booker Prize finalist Chigozie Obioma, who is here to discuss his new novel, The Road to the Country, with conversation partner, local celebrated author, Ron A. Austin. Some notes before we begin. Tonight's event is possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books and the Left Bank Books Foundation, your money goes directly into the local economy, funding your streets, parks, and more. It also helps writers get the support they deserve and allows us to produce events such as this. So thank you all for shopping local and supporting this event. We also want to extend our welcome to our virtual audience this evening. Thank you for joining us from afar. If you have questions, you can submit them in the comments section on YouTube, and I can read them aloud during our Q&A. We at Left Bank Books have a fantastic calendar of events coming your way. Tomorrow evening, sci-fi novelist Lindsay Ellis will be in conversation with fellow author Ann Leckie at the Schlafly Library. Next Tuesday, June 11th, local author Amy Reed will be in the store to talk about her new true crime book, The Imposter Heiress. Also, there's still time for you to pre-order the new Ellen Hildebrand novel, Swan Song, to join her signing line here on June 19th. Just a quick note, unfortunately, yesterday's event, the eBay event, had to be postponed due to travel delays. We will be rescheduling it. We're hoping to reschedule it during June, but just keep an eye out on our social media and our events calendar for the new date and time. A full calendar of our upcoming events can be found on our website. There is sure to be something for everyone. So about tonight's title, The Road to the Country. Set in Nigeria in the late 1960s, The Road to the Country is the epic story of a shy, bookish student haunted by a long-held guilt who must go to war to free himself. Intertwining myth and realism into a thrilling, inspired, and emotionally powerful novel, The Road to the Country is the masterpiece of Chigozie Obioma, a writer Salman Rushdie calls a major voice in literature. Chigozie Obioma was born in Akure, Nigeria. His two previous novels, The Fisherman and An Orchestra of Minorities, were both finalists for the Booker Prize. His novels have won the inaugural FT OppenheimerFunds Emerging Voices Award for fiction, the NAACP Image Award, and the Los Angeles Times Award for First Fiction, and have been nominated for many others. Together, they have been translated into 30 languages. He was named one of Foreign Policy's 100 Leading Global Thinkers. He is a professor of creative writing at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and divides his time between the United States and Nigeria. Ron A. Austin's short stories have been placed in Boulevard, Pleiades, Story Quarterly, Ninth Letter, Black Warrior Review, and other journals. Avery Colt is a snake, a thief, a liar. His first collection of linked stories has received several honors, including the 2017 Nilson Prize, a 2019 Ford Indies Gold Award, a 2020 Devil's Kitchen Reading Award, a 2020 PEN/Robert W. Bingham Prize nomination, and a 2020 Hurston Wright Legacy Award nomination. Austin's work has been supported by grants from the Regional Arts Commission, including a 2016 Artist Fellowship. He, his wife Jenny, and son Elijah, and Caleb, 1-year-old Caleb, live in St. Louis. As an assistant professor of English at St. Louis University, he facilitates undergraduate fiction workshops. Would you all please help me in warmly welcoming Chigozie Obioma and Ron A. Austin for Left Bank Books.
Thank you all for coming. Such a pleasure to be here.
All right, so would you like to go ahead and get started with the reading from The Roads to the Country?
Okay. All right, as I always say, you could be doing something better with your time, but you've chosen to come and listen to me, though I'm sure you're here for Ron. It's a great guy. I love his book. I read it, how many years ago? Was it 2017 or something like that?
It came out in 2019.
Yes, sorry. I was a judge for the Anisfield Wolf Prize. Was that it?
It was, I think it was Hurston, right?
Hudson Wright, yes. One of, I can't barely remember anything now. And it really spoke deeply to me. So I'll read from the middle, I think, of the Road to the Country. Well, context-wise, what do I say? There are two main characters in the novel, basically, is what I'll say. The first one is a seer, who is a middle-aged man who is living and existing in 1917 Nigeria, in Akure, Nigeria, in the southwest. So he's he's racked with guilt because he blames himself for the death of his wife, which he actually in some ways foresaw but never did anything about. And now he's curious. He wants to understand where she is. What does the afterlife actually mean? And then the other main character is Kunle, who is a young, shy character, a young man actually, who is studying at the University of Lagos at the time. And he also has guilt from an accident that crippled his brother. So both of their lives converge in the novel. So right now I'm going to read, oh my goodness, it just scrolled out of the way. No, it's fine. Okay. Again, this is there's something sacred about this iPad. So if I took your copy, you might just disappear. So let me use it. Okay, so I'm going to read from the middle of the novel. 1 second here. Okay, right here. And let me see. It has taken some time, but it occurs to Kunle that he's existing in the significance of his own presence, like a thing without anchor. And now he begins to see things, a refracted light spreading across a distant plane, its reflection brightening up the face of this world. On a track that runs as far as the eye can see, beings are floating in different directions, and from somewhere comes the toll of some unearthly bell, so loud and overwhelming it feels as though he's been plunged into the core of the sound itself. He clamps his hands over his ears and steps away from the place. When he can no longer hear the bell, he looks up and about, and the horizon spread as far as the eye can see is covered in painterly rows of purplish light, as if it were an imagined world, something in a picture book. Again, he wonders, what is this place? He searches for any trace of what the place might be. Where is Agnes? The front, his comrades, the wall. He's covered in dirt, leaves, blood, and mud. There's cement stains beneath the zipper, and on the legs of his trousers, his hat leaves. Have his comrades seen this? The stains must have come from one of those daring times this past few days when he made love to Agnes, hastily in some patch of the bush in the midst of some shelling. And every time Kunle touched her, he felt his soul descend a secret stair into a bunker, sheltered from all the torments of war. He notices now that his right boot has been torn and he can see the top of his foot, the rest of which is rope and dust. His trousers are so dirty and caked with flecks of mud, he He wants to take them off and wash them. He hears a distant cry and turns about, his eyes scanning the undulating stretch of hills as far as they can see. But nothing stares now or makes a sound. When he moves, his feet produce a sound that echoes and tumbles into, when he moves, his feet produces a sound that echoes and tumbles into some vast, endless void and sets off little muffled detonations of sound all around him. It is clear to him that this place is not of the world that he's come to know of his life. Here, one's footstep echoes and occupies space, and what one sees here becomes a thing that is irrevocably seen, and whose form soon changes. Yet he feels alive in some mystic way, and he's become conscious of some change, a growth of the mind, as of a child coming into the recognition of new things. And now, the realization alarms him. He's dead. In the time it takes for this thought to take shape, he finds that the place has changed and the world that only a moment before was hesitant to come into being has suddenly become fully realized. Figures like him are scattered all over the plain, all gazing at themselves, then at this place. And among them are two Biafran infantrymen standing on a terraced path beside a large pot containing some colorful plants with a strange stem carved in several places. He motions at once towards them, but before he can move his feet, the bell tolls. The uniform of the two soldiers are worn and torn, and one has the tag LVII still on the shoulder patch, below the rising sun badge. At first, the two men do not regard him, immersed in the discussion, and their voices penetrate him and lodge in the core of his being. I blame him or the older man in his late 30s is saying, me too, I blame him. If he didn't start shooting at his own men, we will have returned and regained our courage. The younger soldier says, gesturing at himself with a sweep of the hand from his chest down to his waist. Look at me. Just look at me, eh? What will anybody say? That I was killed by my own commander. Chai, raid. Ewo, raid. My brother, it is sad. Chai. Kunle can see the air visibly flowing from the direction it's just left, carrying with it small shiny transparencies. It is a sight so brilliant and extraordinary that he feels his heart lodge. The two men, as if used to the phenomenon, continued their discussion unhindered. Once I saw he was shooting at our people, the older soldier says. I run back to front. In fact, I load my Mark 4, run and see just opposite me there on the Main Market, Bodo men. All of them, they tall, eh? I did not even cock my gun before I hear go. I feel her. Immediately, the bullet from my chest here. The whole of the older soldier has pointed to is a large one, like something shot through with a 7.62 millimeter cartridge used in a brand light machine gun. Light stretches rod-like through him to the other side, forming a small circle on the ground. Kunle remembers his own moment of death, how he fell, and how slowly black edges grew around the field of his vision. He felt pain in his head and his mouth saying words he cannot now remember, and he felt his body yielding to something, like his entire being was being dragged into some unfamiliar realm. The next thing he knew, he was here.
All right, let's have a round of applause. Thanks for the reading. That was really beautiful. I have a lot of really erudite, smart questions, I think, but really I'm most interested in the language and the way that you write. The way that your sentences come together, and especially hearing you read it out loud was amazing. So the first thing that comes to mind is, have you ever written any poetry, or do you read a lot of poetry?
Good question. In fact, yes. I don't believe that I can write poetry, but I have dabbled into it. I actually, it's funny, but the novel began as a poem. So there's a long poem that you can find online, even though it's very different from this book. It has the same title. It's called The Road to the Country. And actually, when I first conceived of the idea of the novel, the structure of the long poem would have been, it's about a 12-page poem. It was what I was thinking, sort of a kind of a prophecy, kind of thing. But it just became unwieldy and impossible to write the novel that way. So yes, that I guess would be my answer. But I think what drew me to fiction writing rather than a different form really is language. I am very interested in. I believe, even though I speak, about 3 other languages, Igbo and Yoruba, I find in the English language a lot of possibilities. I feel like, maybe because it's my language in a way, because, if you're born into a post-colonial contraption like Nigeria is, you almost by default become at least bilingual. And I was trilingual. So it then happens that, you're a little boy, you're having to navigate 3 languages, in fact 4, because, you add a pidgin, which is, also spoken. It's a kind of a form of English. So what you find yourself doing is compartmentalizing and then, like apportioning different uses to different languages. So Igbo was more of like an intimate language with which you converse with your parents and siblings. Then Yoruba was the one for playing outside with friends. So English then, from, in my mind, from very early on, was the language of education and the language of composition. So I think I put it in a kind of almost a separate place where every word becomes this thing that I think about all the time. So maybe that's where the poetry comes from.
There's also a really pleasing tension between the abstract and concrete, especially in the word passages that are really brutal and gruesome in ways, but also very beautiful. There's the one passage where there's the soldier that's died and he's offering a salutation, or maybe it's just an arm, where it's really surreal. With that being said, from the way that the language builds, is the tension between the abstract and concrete elements, is that something that has a greater effect on the novel, a greater effect on the characters and the way that it drives forward?
The abstract, do you mean the mystical?
Yes, the mystical, the magical, the kind of the mind state stuff.
Yeah, indeed it does. I have, as I was saying, talking earlier before, people came in. I think that my aesthetics was shaped very early on by a few things. One of which was, I think it was a combination of the anthropological knowledge that my mom had. So in my part of Nigeria, a lot of due to the colonial reshaping of the landscape and the culture, most people converted to some form of religion, usually Christianity in the southeast. But my mom's family was one of the few holdouts who didn't. Her dad was an ordinary practitioner, which is the Igbo religion. So it meant that she grew up in a home where um, they were kind of the reservoir, or like they were the holdouts of the traditional beliefs. So she would say things that I found very odd and that you wouldn't hear elsewhere. And what I found from interacting with her was that was believed, still believed, I hope, that there's almost no distinction between the metaphysical and the physical planes of existence. They actually exist on the same level, which is what I've tried to incorporate into my work. So it's I know that some people call it magical realism, but if you read any of my novel, I had this funny discussion with someone only a couple of weeks ago. He's insisting, he's writing a dissertation on the fishermen, and he's saying this is a work of magical realism. I'm like, okay, show me a magic event in the novel, and he couldn't point anything out. Because it's not magic. It's not a Garcia Marquez novel, for instance, where a person turns into, a guy with wings and flies, which is magical because it interrupts the normal course of nature. Or someone is stabbed and then their blood floods an entire city. In that novel, for instance, there's a prophecy that is made, and it's a spoken word. It doesn't do any magic. It has a magical import, but it has a mythic influence on the characters. So it almost exists almost like something that shadows them. So it's a state of consciousness, two states of consciousness, I think, or dimensions that I create. Orchestra Minorities, my second novel, is the same. I mean, you can understand the main character Chinon, so he's living his life. He's not aware of this spirit world that is existing on his own separate plane. So there's nothing magical if you take out the cheese plane of existence. Everything that this character does is rational. We can understand it. Same here. So Kunle is existing and fighting in the war, and there's this seer who is living in 1947, and witnessing this vision, everything unfold 20 years from into the future. Kunle is only vaguely aware of the seer, only because he's met the seer before in his own reality. But there's no magic, you see. So all of this is to say that I just believe that mystical reality, mystical realism is a thing that I feel like I want to pursue in fiction.
So I want to come back to this idea of different states of consciousness, as it's really exciting to me, and I can see the way that it works through the novel, especially the way the war functions and affects Kuma and his journey. But to ground things a little bit, what drew you specifically to this conflict? Did you feel called to write about it? And where did the research begin?
So the fact is, I always knew I was going to write this novel. It's very weird because it's my third book, and I've written a lot of things in between. For two reasons. Number one, I come from that part. Okay, first of all, let me give a quick, let's say, background context of the war itself. Then I talk about how I became aware of it. So in the 19th century, the idea of Nigeria began. There was a man who was working for the Royal Niger Company. His name was Frederick Lugard. He was from the center of England. And so he came, so the British were obviously, there had been 50 years before a scramble for African territories. in Berlin, and then Nigeria, or the principality, or the area that is today Nigeria, was a kind of not very much in contest. Some parts of it was being contested by the French. So the British wanted to consolidate the area. So this guy was appointed to be in charge, and he was at the time wooing a woman, Flora Shaw, and really both of them came. So he invited her to Nigeria, and he had this idea that what, they should draw him up, and then he asked her to name the country. It was in fact one of the ways that he wanted, because the woman was kind of on the fence, but he gave her this task of this much gravitas. So she toyed with a few names and landed on Nigeria. So believe it or not, Nigeria as a concept was born because some guy was trying to to get a girl. Anyway, 1914 it is ratified as an actual British protectorate, and so from then on, Nigeria in essence became a country with under British rule. So we had British people as the Governor General of Nigeria. So 1960, as time goes on, you have elites who begin to be educated, most of them in Europe, some of them actually here, but mostly in Britain. And they began, of course, to fight for independence. Ghana became independent, and then other African countries, of course, began to push. 1960, Nigeria becomes independent, and the British leave. And almost immediately, the cracks began to show. Because the fact remains that usually what you have is that there's a sense of, for a nation state to be formed, you need a sense of sovereign identity. We are Americans, and then we form America. Or we are Sweden, then we form a country called, we're Swedish. We have that identity. We maybe even speak a language called Swedish. This is our identity. And then we form a country, named Sweden. But in a country like Nigeria, the country is formed first, and then the people have to do the work of becoming Nigerians. My dad often would joke that his dad or his parents were Nigerians, but they never knew it, all their lives, because they were living in some village. Nobody told them that they were Nigerians until they died, because they were not consulted. So anyway, so we are, so the work of trying to become Nigerians was a tough one, because once that unifying force left, the British, everybody began to question what is this country, in fact. There was a coup in 1966, and then the response to that coup was that the Igbos from the southeast had, killed a lot of Northerners. Long story short, the country erupted and the war began. So I am from the southeast, where the former Biafra, so all my growing up, my parents will often make references to the war. It was as if it divided their existence into two, before and after the war. They'll say something like, oh, so and so happened before the war, and then oh, so and so thing happened after the war. So it was often in my consciousness. And then 1993, for the first time, I left the southwest, Akure, the city, on a trip with my parents to the east. So my dad is from a village, and the following morning, all these people were coming to say hello. to us, and I was about 6 or 7. Was very curious kid, and I noticed that many of them had deformities. There was a man without limbs. There was a woman with one hand, and there was a young girl, probably like 19 or 20, who had some like weird thing, scar on her face, the left side of her face. I maybe it was fire. There was just something. So I'd never seen people with so many deformities in that much concentration. And I asked my mom at the time, what happened to these people? And she just said to me, Obara, which means it was the war. And so that's the kind of thing that gets seared into your consciousness. So over the years, I keep thinking, so the war is what did this to these people. So what is this war? And, I just began to investigate it.
So now we kind of got some thoughts doing. We're talking about the way that the novel explores different mental states, different states of consciousness, and those can be expressed in the concrete and abstract, and they have a direct effect on the characters. I'm even thinking about Kuma and his crew, the way they could exist in sort of a allegorical space. That could just be one reading. Especially think about the character who has the rosary beads,
Yes.
and I'm thinking very much about the imagery of the Red Cross and the symbolism that's very pervasive. But that leads me to one thing that's I'm thinking about the tension between Kunla and the war itself. And specifically, one thing that I was really impressed with was not only the consistent tone of the novel and the progression, but also the way that the narrative distance, that nice third person and the present tense, created a really great avenue for the exploration and deconstruction of Kunla. Specifically in the sense that I really like the moments where he's out of his body. He's inside of it, he's in the war, he's moving, he's out of his body. And you see kind of it's like the indoctrination that he's going through. It's very carefully and subtly explored. And it's almost something that he absorbs. And that's just to say there's that kind of, there's kind of that nice, there's something really nice about the mood there. But with the way that Kunla was rendered and the way that he's steeped in battle and the way that he grows there and changes, was that something that was very intentional and planned progressively, or is it something that just came naturally through exploration of putting this character in this situation?
Well, I wanted to inhabit him, because see, almost all the battles in the novel, this is historical fiction, they're real. They actually happened. And one thing that, I really struggled with, as once I decided that I was going to write a novel, was this actually happened to people. They went through that. And it was just a difficult thing to contemplate, So I wanted my readers to have an experience. I wanted to create an experience, really. And, I feel like this is, in fact, really what we try to do as writers, or in fact, what readers really want to get from fiction. We might say that we want readers to learn something new, or to entertain, or for them to, have some form of empathy for characters. But I think that ultimately readers want an experience that is different from what they're used to on the everyday. Which means that if you are, if you have cats, for instance, and you know so much about cats, if one reads your fiction, they should feel something more or new or fresh about cats. So which meant that I will not merely be observing, but inhabiting, trying to inhabit characters. So I try to put myself in the headspace of Kule as much as possible. and as a way of putting myself in the headspace of just about any soldier, whether it is in Ukraine now or in Vietnam, which was happening concurrently as Biafra, or in Gaza today. So, what does it mean? How does it feel to be in a trench being shelled for like 6-7 hours on end, without stop? When you carry a rifle to face a tank and you know that any minute you could die or be so very badly wounded, like what goes on in people's mind? So these were fascinating questions that I wanted to tackle, and I think I had a lot of those questions. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I wrote a piece for the Financial Times called "In Danger of Researching a War Novel," which was how part of during the course of my research, I had interviewed a lot of veterans, and I mean a few, not a lot, more like civilians who lived through the war. But then I found myself in this taxi, interstate taxi with this guy who was an active soldier fighting Boko Haram, this psychotic terrorist group who a few years ago stole some schoolgirls. Michelle Obama, for instance, was like running campaigns. And so he was a Nigerian soldier, frontline soldier, fighting against them. So, I was curious. So I asked him what it was like to be fighting, a war. And this triggered a lot of, bad memories because he had PTSD, and it became increasingly violent, to almost everybody in the car, because so it became almost dangerous for me, in fact.
So me feeling selfish, I could ask you so many more questions. But with all that being said, I wanted to open up the floor to the audience to see if you guys had any thoughts.
I can speak loud.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm interested, does your mother write, or does she read all your books
No,
and comment on them?
unfortunately, she can't. She doesn't have, she has very minimum education, which is a tragedy, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure she could have, because.
Yes, she would have loved to.
One other thing, elderly lady, white lady like me, will I be able to enjoy and understand your book? I've read one of your other books.
Did you
Yes.
understand it? Yes, so of course you will. Yeah.
Because
think you
it's
will.
out of my realm, really.
See, the
sounds.
thing is, I think it's a human story. I understand that some people might not, it's not very easy to read about war, and it was not
Right.
easy to write. But the weird thing about war, from what I come to understand, is that it is actually in the midst of the carnage and the suffering. It's what brings out, the most humanity in people. In fact, my character, this is the case. He's a very shy man. He doesn't talk to anybody. He's become deeply insular. But the war reforms him. He becomes this different guy who would do anything for his band of brothers, and in fact falls in love during the war. And the last word in the novel, in his part of his section of the novel, is daddy, because he comes to have a child there. So I feel like it's a very human story. And that's what I'm saying. I mean, give it a try.
Hi, I have three questions. I hope I remember them all. The first is about guilt. The two main characters in the book have a lot of personal guilt. I'm very curious as to why you decided to give them that and to have it as, sort of the propelling force for the book. Because if Kunle doesn't have the guilt about his younger brother, he doesn't go, into the war, and if the seer doesn't have guilt about his wife, he doesn't go for that on that path. So I'm very curious as to why you chose guilt as like the propelling force for the both of them in the middle of the war. Second question is about the mystical realism, and the sort of like time travel-ish thing that happens. I'm like 100 pages into the book, so I can't speak for what happens everywhere. But there's a part where the series is looking into the war, and there's a bird, and the bird makes a sound, and the seer also exclaims something, and Kunle hears that. And so I'm curious as to whether you were rigorously thinking about how that works, sort of like in science fiction, like if this, what does the seer do in 1947 that affects the present day event, and how flexible the mystic is, or how the rules of it work. And the
Can
third,
I answer the first two?
Oh, yeah.
My brain, I'm not as smart as you, I will not remember. Okay, well, thank you very much. I don't think anyone has asked me that first question actually, about guilt. I think what I'm most interested in fiction, or one of the things I'm most interested in is kind of exploring a sort of evolution in people, in characters. If you notice, my characters are often beginning at one point, extreme point, and then moving to the other. So, for instance, in The Fisherman, I'm interested in how a brother who loves his brothers, at the beginning of the novel, we turn around to hate them so much as to want to kill them. So that is how do people change? What propels them? So in some ways, the shape of the novel often is a sort of a quest. So I guess that's why I want them. That guilt enables them to take a journey. It's what forces them to do that. And also, you need a motivation, as you know, in fiction. So that's first answer to the first question. The second one is about, how the mystical elements work. Well, I want the mystical elements to be there to frame two different realities. So first is the reality of Kunle, and then the reality of the seer. So really, the narrative present, I also like to play with time. The narrative present in the novel. In fact, you can argue that the entire novel takes place in one night. But in 1940, we never leave 1947. In fact, not to give anything away, because I know all of you will buy the book. In fact, you buy 3 copies. When the vision ends, the seer is shocked to find that there's still the Union Jack, the British flag, flying everywhere. The idea of Nigeria as an independent country that has not even been conceived. But he's just spent almost 3 years watching this war. So he becomes, in some ways, disoriented. So the reason I've done that is to create a situation where, even though the Biafran War is a historical fact, it is experienced like something that hasn't yet happened, something that can be prevented. Because the thing is, it is possible again. The reasons why it happened, you can see some of it happening still in Nigeria. So we often feel like things cannot explode, but it can. The Russia-Ukraine war is a shock to everyone, you know. So can this be prevented? You know, is a question that I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, those answers those questions very well. Thank you. The third, I don't know how much of this is a question, is about how language is working in the book. I mean, I came here yesterday for some other events that was supposed to happen that didn't, and so I took and cut it, and somehow was just not able to stop reading it. And I thought that there was such very good attention to detail. Like there were very tiny things like what is on buildings and like what businesses are going on at that time that I really liked. But I was very interested in the dialogue. I also really liked it because most of the people fighting in the war, like young people out of school and of varying economic backgrounds, and that was present in the dialogue with like certain quote unquote misspellings. But I was curious as to how you choose to balance that variety of English with like the narration, because the narration is pretty standard. And even so when I think I noticed that, I mean, the other characters are different, but Tunde, in his introspection, he's thinking in pretty much formal English, but then when he says things, it's like there are Yoruba phrases and there are exclamations that have a different energy from what I see in like his interior thoughts. So I was very curious as to how you were navigating all of those at those levels.
I mean, it's just you're trying to create this world. I'm thinking of how do I relate to the reader, what I believe that this guy is thinking and what he's saying and what others are saying to him or about him or with him. And, it's not something that I had to overthink, I think. And as I've said before, he's navigating between these languages. In fact, his mom is Igbo. It's one of the reasons why he's conscripted. They said to him, well, you are one of us, fight in the war, even though, he's not his war. So this is, I think, or I thought, the way in which someone like him would have expressed himself. But of course, the overarching language is the English language. And as I've said before, I admire the English language very much. I feel like, as much as I do Igbo and Yoruba as well. But I also do feel that there is unconsciously some form of subconscious translations that are happening. For instance, I was in Germany a couple years ago, and there was a guy who he's a scholar. He works on African literature, and he's done a paper on my 2 books. And he was saying to me, he said, the weird thing about your writing is, he always said this, so he said it again at the interview. Look, your sentences are sometimes, they're not grammatically wrong, but the syntax is very weird. It's not like what, I read in British or American writers writing. So I'm like, okay, point to a sentence that you feel this way, because I don't understand what you are talking about. And he read a sentence, it's something like from our Orchestra Minorities, something like his soul was crying, something like that. And I realized, oh, this is an expression which in my head would have been said in Yoruba, but I have unconsciously, without knowing it, written it in English. So now I understand this thing he says that icks me, but but now it makes sense to me. So the idea of the soul crying it has a kind of a mystical, spiritual sensibility that is not Western, you see.
take that as a compliment.
Yes, I think it was.
Hi. You mentioned that you knew from time that you would write this novel, but we had the fishermen and we had Orchestra Minorities. When you first, like, let's say when you were probably writing this book, did you think this was the form and this was how the story was going to unravel, or do you think the first two novels influenced the mode that the story is currently taking in any way?
No, I don't think they influenced it. So see the thing, I'm allergic to telling a story. I mean, maybe in the short story form, yes, but I feel like the the novel form is for me the greatest form of art. Of course, I'm biased. People will say music and poetry and art, whatever. Yeah, because I feel like this, you can do anything with it. And see, the thing with the canon is it adapts itself. It's very malleable. If we've never had um, an epistolatory novel, and then someone writes one, Maria Maba, for instance, so long a letter, and now, and it's appreciated. It does what a novel is supposed to do, but in a different new way. Then the canon absorbs it. So I feel like each time I engage with a novel, it has to be novel. That's what it means anyway. So I strive to find a different form, at least if not original, achieve an illusion of originality at the very least. And my ambitions are often very big. My vision, at least, initial vision. And I often think that if I'm able to realize 60% of it on the page, then I consider that a success. So that's really it. I always want to tell, a story in a different form. If you open The Fisherman, you would laugh, in fact, because, you will think, what is this thing? It feels, the chapters goes like this. My father is an eagle. My brother is a spider. My mother is an insect, something like that. But really what I've done is tell the story of this family fracturing by association with animals. Like if you think of how a 9-year-old would think of the world, they don't understand very complex things. So they try to rationalize the world to understand it by what they're familiar with. So if he's familiar with comics, when someone who is huge in school, bullies them, they'll say, oh, this guy looks like a Superman, beat me up. So that's it. Like, so the story is told through association with animals. Same thing here is I've just found a different framing. So I will always do that. It has nothing to do with the two previous novels.
Hi. Okay, so yeah, my question is very, it seems a little abstract. I'm thinking about how you sort of situated two, like the two timelines in the novel. One is situated in the in prehistoric Nigeria, sort of pre-formed Nigeria, before Nigeria became Nigeria.
Pre-independence.
Yeah, pre-independent Nigeria. And then the other timeline is in a war that is being fought for the existence or for the right of a different country to exist. So I am interested in how you are thinking about nation building or the existence of the Nigerian nation of today. So just like just talk us through that.
Yeah. Well, I think that I was partly interested in creating again, as I've said. First of all, I wanted to depict this war because see, the scale of the Biafran war is such that nearly 3 million people died. is huge. I think that's probably more than or as much as Vietnam or something. But it was happening concurrently with Vietnam, so most of the attention was in Vietnam. But analysts say that more small weapons were used in it than like rifles, hand grenades, than the Second World War combined. And it was as a result of Biafra that Doctors Without Borders, for instance, was formed. It was a direct response to Biafra. So it's one of the like most tragic wars of the 20th century. But nobody talks about it simply because it involved just Nigeria. On the scale of things, there's a hierarchy of humanity in which African countries are not seen as especially high up there. So I wanted to chronicle that. And what I found also was that you have a lot of nonfiction, you have a lot of memoirs, you have wartime novels, which are books in which civilians are living their lives, and then the war is the backdrop. What shocked me in reading almost everything that's been written about Biafra is that there's almost no war novel that is a novel in which the war is centered, the fight in itself. Like All Quiet on the Western Front, some of the books by Ernest Hemingway, The Right Badge of Courage, Cold Mountain, stuff like that. There's a paucity of that. So I wanted to fill that gap. So those are the things. And I feel like, this is the last analysis because we've run out of time. Each country has, according to, what was his name? The guy who wrote The Legend of the Fall. I've forgotten his name, but he says that there's such a thing as a soul history of every nation. For the US, which is a history that the country will prefer to forget, but that actually that haunts it more than anything else. For the US, is the treatment of African Americans, people of African descent, and Native Americans. For Nigeria, I think it's Biafra. So we need to reckon with that, not to speak in cliche, but also there's a group of young men who often, they come up with these groups, militia groups, because they are disgruntled with how Nigeria is. And, many of them do not know what it means, what it looks like. What does it mean to actually fight wars? So one of them says that he's the president of Biafra in exile. He lives in Norway. So I think that it would be, a good thing to have them actually read a book like this, to actually know what it means to fight, instead of itching for a war, as they often do. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Left Bank folks. I appreciate it as well.
Thank you. Let's hear it for Chigozie in Austin. Ron, I'm sorry. And we have copies of The Road to the Country at the front desk, as well as your previous novels, as well as Ron's book, all at the front desk. You can, we're closing soon, but there's plenty of time for you to grab a book, and I believe they will both be signing.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. So we'll go grab something. Yeah, where is mine?